this is a follow-up question about music. Last week I talked about music and how it relates to dancing. And this is a question from somebody else, but the question is, so on the subject of music, I was wondering if there's any good music with saxophones. Also with music, if some classical composers are not Christians, but the music is beneficial to our health or our mind, can hymns sung by people like Lauren Daigle be okay? Or hymns by Alan Jackson or others? And these are questions about when something is neutral, all by itself. If you just stuck this song in the middle of anybody who didn't know who Lauren Daigle was, or Alan Jackson, or who Claude Debussy, the association of the person, would the song be wrong? And I talk about this in my video series on YouTube about what God and what the Bible says about music. And that is the 4th video. And it talks about gray areas, black, white, and gray areas in the elements of music. And there are some songs that you can take a hymn and combine it with rock music and make it not good. But then if you take the same hymn and you have somebody who is a rock singer, like Elvis had a whole entire thing on hymns, but look at his lifestyle. Does that association, even if they're not singing it wrong, will that affect your life? Maybe. And that's why it's a gray area. So that's what I want to discuss. Guilt by association. There's 2 elements, guilt by association and making provision for your flesh. I really dig a lot more into this in that video on YouTube, but just in a nutshell, this is Romans 14, where you see that there was meat. And the meat, if you just ate the meat and you didn't ask where it came from, it was just a piece of meat and you could eat it. And Paul said, there is nothing unclean. But when you make it a stumbling block to somebody else, that is when it becomes unclean, because we are to be charitable. And that is what Paul is really emphasizing in Romans 14, to walk charitably, charity above our own personal liberty. And that is like almost heresy in today's society. No, what's mine is mine. Liberty is mine. How dare you try to judge me and say that I should walk charitably amongst somebody else? They should be charitable to me and let me do whatever I want to do. But the fact is that if you are in your car and you're listening to Lauren Daigle singing hymns, and she does have a beautiful voice, but she's also associated with homosexuality and having a questionable profession of faith, and saying that her concerts are her church, which is anti-biblical. So even though she's a nice person, that can be a stumbling block to somebody else who's sitting there, who, especially if they've struggled with contemporary Christian music and they've separated from that because it is like the world and all of the fruits that come with jazz music, etc. And it could draw them back into that style of music, or they could look at you and think, oh, well, that person's a good Christian and they're listening to Lauren Daigle, and they might be listening to all of Lauren Daigle's music, and therefore it must be okay. And then they can not only, go further and actually step into sin beyond the hymns that you're listening to, but also going against their conscience of wanting to be separated, and they're trying to be fully persuaded, but then they're not fully persuaded because they are deceived by the appearance of what you're doing, even though you understand what I'm saying? So you just have to be cautious how you do this. So walk charitably to not discourage a person, especially if they are really actively. It is discouraging when you see how many people walk away from the faith because of music. It is just that powerful. And so you can discourage somebody to be like, oh, the whole world is going downhill. I can't even go into the car of somebody I thought was a solid, separated Christian, and here it is. They're listening to this person too. It can cause confusion because they don't know. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it their voice? And sometimes artists, they can sing Amazing Grace in the most sensual manner possible. And it does cross that line to where it's inappropriate and it causes confusion or temptation. But the last point of this is making provision for your flesh and making provision for somebody else's flesh. If you're drawn to a certain style of music and it pulls you, I think of the Roop Sisters, you know, they are Southern gospel, and Southern gospel just seems to be more acceptable, even though it has a lot of rock music in it. But the Roop Sisters are just renowned for how well they sing hymns a cappella. But if you listen to their entire albums, they have pop music, they have pop country music, they have just straight up ethereal rock, contemporary Christian music. And when you are trying to fight the fight against the temptation and draw of music, and then you're like, well, I'm just going to listen to their one song, and then you're like, but then I'm actually just going to listen to their playlist on Spotify, and then it just works its way into your life. So you have to be careful from the well from which you're drawing your music. So I would just be careful. If you really struggle with music, don't go to that well. If you don't struggle with music and you're like, well, I found this one person, for instance, Mormons have excellent hymns and instrumental music, and you could just pick one song from their album and it's neutral. But would I recommend anybody just go and get a whole entire album of Mormon music and then you're going to be singing the first hymn of Joseph Smith? No, be careful of the well. Make not provision from the flesh for the flesh. And I really just encourage people to say, do you want, if the line is right here and sin is over here and the fruits of sin are going to be creeping their way into your lives, do you really want to just sit on the line, or do you want to make a little bit of space so that you don't have to ask the question, is what I'm listening to wrong? And that just goes across all of the boards in these gray areas of being of the appearance of evil and being a stumbling block and guilt by association. Just, Paul said if he had to, he wouldn't even eat any meat if it would help the Christian world.